All right, now I'd like to welcome to the show Vance Ginn, economist, consultant, podcaster, think tanker, and former White House economic policy advisor. Welcome to Free the Economy, Vance.
Richard, it's a pleasure to be with you today. Thank you for the opportunity.
All right, now, of course, you are a podcaster yourself. We're part of the sacred fraternity of podcasters on economic policy, no less. And on your show, Let People Prosper, it has some sort of similar focus to some of the stuff we talk about here on Free the Economy. What made you want to start your show? And what kinds of things will people learn when, of course, they will become listeners in the future?
Well, of course, I hope so. Check it out on any of the platforms. And Let People Prosper is really my mantra. It's what my calling is to help people prosper overall. And ultimately, that's by getting government out of the way. I'm a classical liberal. I look at things from a free market perspective, looking at it from different schools of economics. I'm a PhD economist by trade from Texas Tech University. And, I look at it through a prism of Austrian school economics, Chicago school, public choice, kind of a combination, institutional economics. And so, building off of the work that they've done over time between James Buchanan, Frederick Hayek, Leonid Mises, Milton Friedman, and others, I think it's important for us to have our voices heard out there in a system that oftentimes has too many people pushing more government on us from the right and the left of the political spectrum these days. And there needs to be more of these types of discussions. And so I started my podcast almost a year ago. And it's been phenomenal to get a lot of folks on. I have one show every week that brings on a guest, kind of like we're doing today. And then I have another part of my show that just called This Week's Economy, where I talk about what's going on in the economy. And it's been great. I've got a lot of good feedback, and I've enjoyed listening to your podcast as well. So it's really a pleasure to be here today.
Oh, fantastic. And, when you sort of went through some of your kind of like influences and background in like economic thinking, you mentioned something that a lot of people here in DC are familiar with, the idea of public choice or public choice theory about economics. And I think that really gets the idea where, you just said, and I always say in the intro that we do every week, that, we're looking for a sort of more prosperous future with less government control. And of course, our friends on the left will often say, well, but the government's here to do good things for you. That's what you should want. They may not say they want more control, but they may say they want more government, more funding, more programs. And I think the question that the public choice theorists talk about is an important part of why we don't always want more government programs and people in charge of our lives. Can you just give a real quick Econ 101? What is public choice theory and why is it kind of important?
Yeah, Richard, public choice theory and economics has really had a pivotal part of my learning and what I do now, because it's important to think about supply and demand, what's going on in the economy, kind of your classical economics overall. But what that did was avoid or not really discuss the rational decisions that are made by politicians. It doesn't take into account that they are also rational, doing what's in their best interest, and they don't have the same sort of private costs and benefits, marginal cost and marginal benefits, if you think about it from that perspective, that we do out in the private sector. They have something else that's involved, and that's winning votes. So there's rent seeking that's talked a lot by James Buchanan, Gordon Tolick, a lot of other folks today, where if you look at what these decisions are made by these politicians, it's not just what's going to be best for the overall economy. It's how do we get reelected? And we've got to be able to make sure that we take into account those decisions by lawmakers, because if we don't, then we end up in a worse situation. There's a lot of talk about market failure from a number of perspectives and a number of areas. I'm not one who believes there are actually very many market failures that are out there. I think there are more government failures. The government failures end up being worse overall for people when they come in, influence the market, influence prices. Prices are nothing but signals. And whenever you distort those signals through government regulation, taxes, and other things to try to socially engineer society, you come up with worse outcomes. Imagine that. And that's where we've seen top-down government control from socialism, forms of communism, dictatorships. That's not what we want. We don't want extractive institutions. We want inclusive institutions, from capitalism to a bottom-up approach that really allows for, to let people prosper. Free the economy, right?
Yeah, exactly. I just think it's interesting that, people often criticize people in the business world and say, oh, well, they're just out to make profit. They don't have your best interests at heart, really. They just want to make money. But of course, no one sort of looks at actors in the political realm, or I think all too rarely, and says, well, they have interests as well, and sometimes even then they're financial. But even if they're not financial, being hungry for power is, I think, is just as bad as being hungry for money, especially if you have some sort of political authority that you might be tempted to abuse in order to get more power. And I think that's true, like you said, of politicians and elected leaders. But I think it's also true of people who work in government, the bureaucrats, what are, our friends call the deep state, people who have long careers in administrative government and have a lot of authority to regulate the private sector. When they make choices, they have the ability to be completely self-interested, theoretically possible, but they also have the ability to pretend like they're acting in the common good while also giving private benefits to them and their fellow bureaucrats and politicians. And it's not that one side is terrible and one side is virtuous either way, but I just think it's strange to say that, well, potentially there's negative incentives for people in business to act badly, but it's pretty rare that we have people who acknowledge, well, no, there's also plenty of negative incentives for government workers and government officials to act
Mhm.
negatively.
And Richard, a great kind of example of that is I had the opportunity. I was the chief economist for the Office of Management and Budget in the Trump White House, and there were a lot of decisions that were being made. I was there from June 2019 to May of 2020, and you see all these different ideas that are going on. I mean, behind the scenes, not everybody was agreeing about the next steps that we should be taking, and it was interesting to see the push to help out kind of the steel industry when you think about tariffs. And it goes in directly to what you're talking about there, is you have folks like Peter Navarro, for example, who thinks that it was very important to go after China to help out the steel industry and things of that nature. Whereas you had other folks like myself who was saying, no, we need to let the markets work, because if you try to help out the steel industry, you're going to hurt a lot of other industries in the process that have to pay a higher price for steel than they otherwise would. And maybe there were some other issues that we should be thinking about China and their issues that they have going on over there. Maybe we should be probably providing more free trade with more allies, right? Like the Trans-Pacific Partnership was a big push that I kept trying to get. But I think with trade, it shows that we try to help those, like pick winners who we want to help out, and losers end up being everyone else. And unfortunately, the consumer, we think about we're helping or hurting businesses, but businesses are no more than people. It's one of the reasons why I don't think we need a corporate tax. You're really just taxing people at the end of the day. And so we get in this mindset, though, that we are taxing the rich, we're taxing businesses, we're helping out certain businesses with subsidies and tax breaks and corporate welfare, when at the end of the day, it's all our money, it's all individuals and taxpayer money. And
Right.
what they really should be focused on is less government spending, which is the true burden of how much government is.
Yeah, and the question of how heavy that burden is, I think, is a really important one. The you know when you uh, say compare burdens like that, you would say, well, we'll compare it to the next most reasonable alternative. But the U.S., in a way, the U.S. being the leading economy of the world, doesn't really have any peers.
Hmm.
So that's kind of tough. But that leads me into my next question, which is that every year here in D.C., of course, we have the State of the Union address, and whoever's president at the time uh, comes before Congress and gives a speech about how the country's doing. It's really more about how his administration is doing. But traditionally, whoever does that says, they always start by saying the state of the union is strong, and then they get a standing ovation. Um, when you take a big picture look at the U.S. economy right now, is it strong? And where are we? Are we like 5 star, 3 stars out of 5? Are we 7 out of 10? Like where are we at right now?
Yeah, I mean, it's something that I look at quite often, talk about it on my program as well. And I think that there are some strengths to the economy, especially on the surface. But whenever you get underneath the surface and look under the hood, there's a lot of weaknesses out there in the economy. I mean, if you think about it, we had an extraordinary natural experiment, if you will, from COVID, the shutdowns, all of the destruction that created, where there were 22 million jobs that were lost across the economy. The unemployment rate, it went up to 14%. and just the devastation that created in people's lives and people losing businesses. The national debt has increased by more than $7 trillion since that time period, up to more than 31 trillion. And now there's discussion about debt ceiling debates and what they should be doing. But it was driven by the excessive spending and shutdowns over that period of time. I think it was a massive government failure, if you will, over that period. But now, if you look at the economy, the unemployment rate down to 3.4% as we're talking about this today. The labor force participation rate's a little bit below where it was before in February of 2020. The employment to population ratio for 25 to 54-year-olds, what they consider the prime age working group, that's back up to where it was before. So some of these things can indicate that we're a stronger economy, but I think there's a lot of weaknesses. During this period, you remember early on, they talked about transitory inflation, or at first there was no inflation, right? Mm-hmm. And then it was transitory inflation, and then they started saying a little bit more, but in my view, it was going to be persistent inflation because you had a period where you had a lot of supply shocks early on, but then you had a huge demand shock with the increase in these checks that were being sent out, the plus ups and unemployment benefits, the increase in the money supply from $4 trillion of the Federal Reserve's balance sheet to $9 trillion. And it's still almost right there. It's like 8.6 trillion now. All of that was increasing demand compared to supply. Too much money chasing too few goods. You're going to see massive inflation. And we got up to 9% inflation last year. And this is continuing to hurt. And it's down to about 5% now. But that's continuing to hurt American workers. And what we've seen is that over the last 25 months, more than 2 years now, essentially since Biden took office and he passed the American Rescue Plan Act, we've seen that inflation has outpaced average weekly earnings. Year over year, it's been declining, meaning that you can't purchase as much as you did, even as your wages and hourly earnings are going, or weekly earnings are going up. Mm-hmm. And so I think that's one key indicator that shows the amount of stress that's on Americans across the economy. 60% of Americans are living paycheck to paycheck. 69% of Americans say that, inflation is the number one thing that's on their mind right now. And when you talk to folks and you go to the store to buy food, it just seems like it's going up all around us. And so I think that those create weaknesses in the economy. And the other thing is the banking crisis. You've got these banks that stocked up on a lot of the debt. And now as those bond prices are going down, devaluing, that's created an issue of mark-to-market valuation there that kind of killed Silicon Valley Bank, Signature Bank, other banks, Capital, what was it, First Capital Bank? No. First Republic Bank. And so there were some other ones that I think there's going to be more of that happening. We're going to see more of a domino effect, especially the smaller regional banks. And this is a creation of too much money put in the system, too much government debt that was added on, and this has repercussions. And so I see this as a weaker economy that will have a pretty deep recession if we're not already in one now this year, and that's going to hurt Americans a lot.
Well, yeah, and I think one of the legacies of this is the sort of the ratchet effect of government intervention. So during COVID starting in 2020, we had a very unusual situation. We had this big disease epidemic, and so you had really pretty massive intervention from Congress and from executive programs. From the CARES Act, you had the checks that went out. Like you said, the sort of enhanced unemployment insurance, student loan debt, eviction moratorium, all these things. And the problem, though, is how do you climb back down from an emergency footing, right, and put things back to a normal equilibrium? Because some of those things, of course, are popular, like the student loan debt repayment pause. That was supposed to be a temporary emergency measure. That's what all of these things were supposed to be. But then when you go to turn that back to normal, people say, "Oh, no, you can't do that. You're putting a huge burden on people," as if it were, as if you were coming out of left field and saying you need to pay back twice as much or something, right? So we have the problem. We've had this problem for ages in American government, where any government benefit or privilege that is extended, even if it was meant to be temporary, ever dialing it back to normal is perceived as taking something away from someone that's unjust. So it becomes politically very difficult, which means every dollar that ever spent goes up and up and up and up, and you have to fight 10 times as hard even to get back to normal, much less actually cut anything. Where do you think that sort of trend and dynamic is going in terms of this most recent giant jump in government spending, government debt.
It reminds me of what Milton Friedman said: "Nothing is as permanent as a temporary government program." Right, and I think that's true, and we're seeing that a lot now. There was some decline in government spending last year, which is one reason that it brought down the deficit from 2.8 trillion down to 1.4 trillion. Of course, Biden tried to argue that that was because of his policies, but it was really just the expiration of some of those pandemic related expenditures over that period, and then some higher increase in revenue than they had projected initially. And so whenever you look at some of those things, I'm hopeful that some of those will continue to expire, but I'm fearful that many of them will continue as we're seeing spending continue to ratchet up, and we're seeing, just net interest on the debt. So just the amount of interest we're having to pay on the debt over time on an annual basis is going to be $1 trillion soon. There's reports out just recently that I was looking at that net interest on the debt is now matching what we're paying on national defense per year. I mean, just it's unthinkable of the things that's going on right now. And I mean, if somebody was a progressive or libertarian or conservative, I think we can all think about better ways to be spending that money than on all this massive net interest on the debt. And it's going to continue to go up. I mean, a large share of our interest on our debt is going to roll over in the next year at the higher interest rates that we have, which is going to put more pressure on the budget. It's going to put more pressure on the economy and interest rates. And it goes back to this point you're making here of permanent programs. We've got to find a way to rein in the size and scope of government, to really rethink about what's the principal approach for what government should be spending its money on. I think we're spending on way too many areas that the federal government shouldn't be involved in at all. It should be devolved more to the states, if the government's going to do it at all, and ultimately to the people. And if we could do that, we would find a way to start ratcheting down government spending, getting things back in order. And I've long been in favor of a fiscal rule. I helped put that in the president's last report budget that he reported in fiscal year 2020. Didn't get it anywhere really, but at least there was mention of a fiscal rule, something that's based on, in my view, population growth plus inflation, or something that can help to rein in the growth. Because if not, you're going to continue to have massive deficits, net interest in the debt and everything else. And just the last thing there is, over the last 20 years, there's been about $18.5 trillion added to the national debt over the last 20 years across Republican and Democrat presidencies and Congresses and everything else. If spending had just matched population growth plus inflation over that period, instead of 18.5 trillion, it would have been $500 billion deficit. So we would have $18 trillion more in our pocket back in the economy, instead of it being taken out, siphoned out for our kids and our grandkids to pay, and us to pay for over time.
Yeah, that's the thing that I think is tough for some people with these giant numbers, billions and trillions of dollars. It's so outside the scope of an amount of money that any normal person deals with. I think that it becomes sort of like numb after a while to this, like throwing these giant numbers around. But I think, and because we had such a huge spike in spending and deficit during the pandemic, it's also created this sort of weird situation where the White House, President Biden can now say, "Oh, we've slashed the deficit." It's like, well, it was like a once in a century giant spike, so of course it's come down somewhat, even if it hasn't. If you say like, well, we're on a really strict diet. Yesterday I ate 20 cheeseburgers, but today I only ate 10 cheeseburgers. So really, you could see the pounds must be dropping away, only eating 10 cheeseburgers a day. So that's sort of in kind of economic statistics terms, that's kind of a like false starting point to have the most money we've spent in a century as your starting point, and say, oh well, now we're spending slightly less.
Yeah, and to continue that point is, a lot of the pandemic related measures, expansion of SNAP, the food stamp programs, Medicaid, where people couldn't if their income goes out, or their ages go above the threshold, they couldn't get off the program. So it was basically an expansion of Medicaid across the country since the pandemic started. Those are just now expiring, taking off, and this is 3 years later. I
Mhm.
mean, we've been past this for a while, I think, and people are getting back to work and everything else. And I think it's one reason why there's been such a labor shortage is that people are sitting on the sidelines. Casey Mulligan has done a lot of good work in this area on the redistribution recession of the Great Recession. I think this is the redistribution recession on steroids. As
Mhm.
people continue to stay home, they've racked up all this amount of savings compared, when the checks were being sent out, the plus ups for unemployment benefits, how much you can get on Medicaid. I've seen some studies that show that people were getting about $100,000 on a year if you annualize just the benefits they were getting during the pandemic when may have been making $30,000 a year before that. So there's a lot of distortions that have happened over the last couple of years, and I don't think that that's going to go away overnight. I think that there's some psychological changes that people are going to have for work. Work really brings about purpose, dignity, respect for yourself from others, and it's the way that we earn things, right? I mean, we have to give up some stuff. There, nothing is free. You got to give up some stuff to get something else, and part of what we give up is our leisure time in order to work, so that way we can have more leisure time. And we're not I don't think we're learning that as much right now. I think this is going to have a longer term effect on the labor market, the economy, and other areas. And you add in AI and some of the other stuff that's happening right now. It's like there's a lot of things to be concerned about for the future. Even though I'm an optimistic economist, I'll say
Mhm.
that. But there are definitely some concerns out there.
Yeah, my old friend, our founder here at CEI, Fred Smith, liked to refer to himself as a despairing optimist. But there's there's some reason for despair, but he's still optimistic. So we mentioned a lot of stuff that is federal level policy, congressionally authorized spending and things like that. But then in the middle of that, there's also things like unemployment insurance and Medicaid that also have a state level uh, effect as well. So you've done a lot of work with state think tanks in Texas, Louisiana, and we've had some state policy people here on the show recently, including my good friend Brooke Medina of the John Locke Foundation in North Carolina. Uh, when you look at, since you've done this both, right at the top level with the White House and then with some of these state think tanks, what's the biggest difference in working economic policy at federal versus state level?
Yeah, that's a good question. There's a lot. One of the things at the federal level is that if you think about what you want to pass, you can continue to rack up massive deficits, right? And it's also can be difficult to get good legislation passed because it takes an act of Congress, and so it's difficult to really ratchet down government spending to have big reforms. You really get maybe one chance, kind of like with the Trump administration with the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, right? You get one chance to get something done that's big. The Biden administration, the American Rescue Plan Act. They've had some other ones too, but that's just given the makeup of Congress. And so it's more difficult to get things done at the federal level. But you also just you can keep running up the credit card or printing the deficit away and creating more inflation in the process. And so there's not a restraint in that sense. Whereas if you look at the states have balanced budget amendments in 49 out of the 50 states. I think Vermont's the only one that doesn't have one. And so you have a balanced budget requirement. And so that helps to rein in, government spending, what they can do and infiltrating the economy with more government spending and other sort of things. And I think that's a good check and balance to have in the system. You also have spending limits in a majority of states across the country. And that also helps to keep spending from growing too fast. You kind of have the gold standard for a number of years in Colorado, their taxpayer bill of rights, which is based on population growth plus inflation. It's been weakened over time as they're like, hey, we can't live up to these standards that are here. And so they've weakened it some. Texas, where I live, they passed a stronger spending limit in 2021 based on population growth and inflation, and that's been done over time from some work that I worked on a lot for called the Conservative Texas Budget while I was at the Texas Public Policy Foundation for about a decade, and is basically just saying, look, don't spend more than this amount. And now I'm the chief economist at the Pelican Institute in Louisiana, but also a senior fellow for a number of other state think tanks where basically we come out with these numbers. Here's the responsible budget that shouldn't go above population inflation. And it puts a marker out there, something that's tangible. Because as you mentioned earlier, Richard, people can't think so much about billions and trillions of dollars. And you say you want to shrink government or limit the growth of government. But what does that really mean? This makes it tangible to say, look, it shouldn't go above X. And when you have that number out there, it starts to redefine the narrative about how much government spending there should be, what the policies are that go underneath that. And when you have that discussion, I think it's really provided more benefits for the states that I've been working with for a number of years now. And then what you get to do is when you start reining in government spending, you start running surpluses. Now you can think about how do we return that money to taxpayers by flattening income taxes, which we have a flat tax revolution that's happening across the country, or eliminating income taxes. People are talking about that now, or lowering other taxes. I mean, I think this really gets to the point of you want more money in the productive private sector and less money in the unproductive government sector. The more that you do that, the more profitable that people will be in the process. And I think that you want you want government to grow at a slower rate than the economy. That's why population growth plus inflation is a better measure than, let's say, personal income growth or gross state product, if it should grow at all. I should mention that that's only a maximum. I would really like to see government being cut, government spending being cut. But it's also important too, like occupational licensing. There's so much that states should be doing, and not the federal level, if we're going to do it at all. I think most occupational licensing should be eliminated. But states need to make sure that they are cognizant of the federal government and the deficits that they're running, that they're going to have to cut government spending soon. And some of that, I think, will influence what states are doing, like with Medicaid and other sort of programs.
Well, yeah, I think, in any given state, if you want to do something to encourage more economic growth or job growth, obviously there's the big picture stuff that people pay a lot of attention to, like what's the state budget, what's the state, the top, state income tax rate, things like that. But I think, you talked to a lot of these state legislators out there, and they'll say, well, we're doing everything we can here, but these guys in DC, they're the ones causing the high inflation, right? The Nebraska state legislature can only do so much about the amount of price inflation in Nebraska, right? So part of this is sort of finding what are the right levers to pull at each level of government, right? There's certain things that we'd like federal government people to be doing, and Congress to vote for, or whoever the next president is going to be, what he or she is going to do. But there's obviously stuff that is more in the hands of state legislators, and every once in a while you get a state politician who I think has gotten it in the back of their head that they want to be president someday. So they start talking about all these like big national issues, things that maybe don't actually have that much to do with state government. But in general, most of the people working there for state agencies and state legislatures, they really want to do the right thing for, their voters. And so I think for us, policy advocates, people who are making recommendations, suggestions, writing op-eds, things like that, is trying to sort of nudge them into like the most productive things that they can do for the level they're at, whatever job they have. So I'd love to see some of these states, like you said, repeal, make it legal to get a job, repeal occupational licensing requirements at the state level, and rein in some of these state budgets and do some tax simplification and things like that. While maybe not worrying so much about big national level things, culture war issues, I'm sure someone who is the treasurer of a single state may have strong opinions about the China-Taiwan conflict, but they're probably not going to solve it from their office. So that's just sort of my suggestion, is that when we're interacting with people who are office holders anywhere, I think it's valuable to give them the most encouragement to focus their attention in the ways that will actually be most productive.
Yeah, no, I agree with that. And I think that, it's also going back to public choice again. The politicians that are closest to the people, you have the most influence over. And I think, yes, they're all going to be there to win elections, but when you get removed and you get to DC, that connection with the voters isn't there. It's not as close as it once was. That's why local government is closest to the people. That should be the most responsive to the needs of the people within that community. And of course, the states would be the next one, and then the federal level. But I also agree with what you're saying there too about, I think we've kind of seen this movement, I guess you can call the national conservatives, NatCons, this movement towards an expansion, whether it be from the right or the left, thinking more about if we just had the right people in power, that we can make the changes that put it in our direction through government. And I think this is a mistake. I think that's been tried time and again, that has not turned out well. And it leads to more control, more influence by government, more regulations, higher spending, higher taxes, as you try to socially engineer society. And I just don't think that that's a role for government. I think instead, we should let the market work. Markets don't corrupt our morality. Markets allow for us to have our morality in our individual sense and deal with other people throughout the process through exchanges. And if people like what we're doing and like what we're able to provide, they'll want to exchange with us. And if they don't, if those things that we're doing are not acceptable in the marketplace, then they will not be profitable. They won't continue, and so they'll be weeded out in the process. And so I think I'm concerned about this kind of top-down approach that we're seeing across the country in a lot of ways. I'm concerned about some of the stuff that's in some of the books that are in schools. I'm concerned about some of the other things that are happening, but I think that's a big reason for school choice
Mhm.
and allow for parents to be empowered, and empowering parents there, like social media. Why is the government telling us what to do, as parents with our kids, and they're being on social media? We maybe we need more information that the government maybe could provide in schools or something else, but let us parent, let us be ourselves in those ways. And so I think that we've seen some of that happen, and I'm hopeful that we'll get back more toward the fiscal soundness that goes on, where government should be reined in and allow for people to flourish in the process.
All right, that does sound like a plan for letting people prosper. This has been a great conversation. And before we go, please tell people where they can find you in all the various places online.
Yeah, Richard, thanks again so much for this opportunity. It was a great discussion today. You can find me at Let People Prosper on all the major platforms that are out there. You can also find me at vanceginn.substack.com, where I have a newsletter that comes out weekly, and you can find some information there. And vanceginn.com is where I have a lot of my other information. So please check that out, some of the things that are going on, because we have a lot of ways that we need to be reining in government and making sure that people can flourish and prosper overall, because that happens through free markets, not more government.
All right, excellent. Thank you, and we will no doubt be hearing more from you. I'm sure I'll be mentioning all your stuff on many future episodes.
Sounds great. Thanks so much.